I have watched my brother, the Duke of Varnicliffe, refuse 17 women. I do not say that to shame him. I say it because when the 18th arrived, the one my grandmother had kept deliberately quiet, the one she had hidden, as she later confessed with no apology whatsoever, like the best wine behind the cooking sherry, I understood at last what she had been doing. She had not been failing, she had been waiting, and she had, as she nearly always did, been right. My name is Edmund Ravel. I am the second son of the late Duke, the one who did not inherit the estate, the title, or the impossible responsibilities that came with both. I inherited instead a small income, a decent horse, and the extraordinary privilege of watching my elder brother, Cashin, make himself miserable for the better part of 3 years. I watched from close enough to see every grimace, every stiff dinner, every polite morning call that ended with the young woman in question departing Varnicliffe House with her mother and a thin, careful smile, and my brother retreating to his study before the carriage wheels had cleared the gate. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing that made it worse to watch. He was scrupulously, exhaustingly courteous to all of them, and then he would close the door, and the next week our grandmother would produce another name, and the whole ceremony would begin again. I should explain what the ceremony looked like because it mattered. It was always the same. The young woman would arrive and look at the house first, the great portico, the long windows, the width of the park, and then at Cashin in that order, and that order was the thing he noticed, and the thing he could never quite forgive. He was not unreasonable about it. He understood, I think, that Varnicliffe was a very large house, and that to a girl of 20 with a careful mother, the sight of it could reasonably precede everything else. But he felt it nonetheless, that fractional delay, that beat of inventory before she looked at him, and something in him closed each time, like a door pulled gently but firmly shut. He would spend the morning walk or the luncheon or the evening in perfect courtesy, asking the right questions, making the right observations, and every one of those young women left thinking very well of the Duke of Varnicliffe, and none of them, when they climbed back into their carriages, had any particular reason to think he had wanted them to stay. I asked him once, after the 8th or 9th, what exactly he was looking for. He stood at the window of his study, staring out at the winter park, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I don't know, Edmund, someone who doesn't look at the house before she looks at me." I thought about that for some time. It was not an unreasonable thing to want. It was, perhaps, an impossible one. Our grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Varnicliffe, a woman of 74 who wore her silver hair like a crown and her opinions like armor, had been told this difficulty. She had listened, or appeared to listen, with her hands folded in her lap and her dark eyes very steady, and then she had said, "Then I shall have to be more creative." She had not explained what she meant. She never did. I had learned by the age of 12 that her explanations arrived only after the fact, when they could no longer be argued with. The invitation came in late autumn, when the leaves at Varnicliffe were brown and gold, and the morning air had the first cold bite of approaching winter. My grandmother was hosting a small gathering, not a ball. She was insistent on that because balls, she said, were performances designed to frighten the genuine out of everyone. A house party, 4 days, 14 guests, the usual families, the usual daughters, and one name I did not recognize. Miss Doyle. I mentioned the unfamiliar name to my grandmother the morning the invitations went out. She was at her writing desk, signing correspondence, and she did not look up. "Henrietta Doyle's granddaughter," she said. "Henrietta and I were at school together. She has been gone these 12 years. The girl has a modest competency, no connections to speak of, and a library that would make your brother weep." "A library," I said. 3,000 volumes. She catalogued them herself at the age of 16. My grandmother signed her name to another letter and set it aside. "She will not come." "I beg your pardon. I have invited her twice before. She declines. She keeps to herself and her grandmother's house and that library, and she has made it very clear to anyone who asks that she has no interest in the marriage market." She picked up a fresh page. "I have written to tell her that there will be no eligible men at this party." I stared at her. "Grandmother, there will be Cashin." "Cashin is always at his own house. One does not think of one's host as eligible." She paused, dipping her pen. "Besides, I did not lie to her. I said no eligible men. Cashin has refused 17 women. He is, at present, ineligible." I could not argue with this. It was, in its way, entirely accurate. Miss Doyle came. She arrived the second afternoon, after most of the other guests had already settled in and the first awkward round of introductions had been survived. I happened to be in the entrance hall when the carriage pulled up, a plain, modest conveyance, well-maintained but without any particular show, and when she stepped down onto the gravel, I saw her before my brother did. She was not what the other young women at the party were. She was not dressed to be seen. Her coat was a deep, practical blue, and she wore it with the air of someone who had chosen it because it was warm and reliable, not because it was fashionable. She was slight, with dark hair pinned up quickly, a few strands escaping already, and she carried a leather satchel over one arm as though she had forgotten it was there, which told me something about her. She looked up at the house with an expression I had never seen on any other arriving guest. Not awe, not calculation, not the careful performance of modesty. She looked at Varnicliffe House the way one looks at a moderately interesting problem, with a mild, assessing curiosity, and then looked away from it to check on the driver and make sure her trunk was being managed properly. She did not look for the Duke. I think that was when I began to understand what my grandmother had been doing. Cashin met her at dinner that evening. I watched him across the table, discreetly, I hoped, though my grandmother caught me at it and gave me the faintest smile. He was seated 3 chairs away from Miss Doyle, far enough for safety, near enough to hear. She was deep in conversation with old Mr. Pemberry, who was half-deaf and very fond of history. And she was, I could see this clearly, genuinely, entirely absorbed in what he was telling her, leaning forward a little, asking questions that made the old man straighten with pleasure in his chair. She did not look at my brother until he spoke across to her, which he did after the fish course, asking what they were discussing. She turned to look at him with the same assessing expression she had given the house. Not nervous, not performing, just looking. The dissolution of the monastic libraries, she said. Mr. Pemberry's great-uncle was involved in some of the documentation. Cashin blinked. Is that so? He believes several of the inventories were falsified, she said, and turned back to Mr. Pemberry. My brother sat with his wine glass halfway to his mouth for a moment before he set it down again. I watched something shift in his face, not displeasure, nothing like it. More like the expression a man wears when he has been walking in flat country for a long time and suddenly perceives a rise in the ground ahead. The next day it rained. The house party took refuge indoors, and while most of the guests gathered in the drawing room or the music room, I found Cashin in the corridor outside the library, not entering it, just standing there with his hands behind his back. "She's in there," he said without looking at me. "Miss Doyle. She asked our grandmother this morning if she might spend the morning reading. Apparently she brought 3 books in that satchel and has already finished one." He paused. "She said she hoped it was not an imposition." "Is it?" "It is the most reasonable request I have heard from a guest in 3 years," he said. He did not move. I waited. He said eventually, "I cannot simply walk in there." "You are the Duke of Varnicliffe. It is your library." "That is precisely the problem." He turned away from the door. "It would look as though I had followed her there." "I considered this. You have followed her there." He gave me a look that would have been withering if he had managed to look less uncertain. Then he went back down the corridor, and I waited until he turned the corner before I knocked softly on the library door. "Come in," said a voice, clear, a little distracted. I opened the door and looked in. She was in the window seat, curled into it with an ease that made it obvious she had found good window seats before, the book open on her knee, the gray light from the rain-streaked window falling across the page. She looked up. "Oh," she said. "I thought your grandmother said it was all right." "It is entirely all right," I said. "I'm Edmund Ravel, the less consequential one." Something crossed her face that might carefully have been a smile. "She mentioned you." "Kindly, I hope. She said you were sensible and had not, unlike your brother, given yourself airs about it." She looked back at her book, then back at me, deciding something. "Mr. Ravel, is your brother going to feel obliged to come and check on the library while I am in it?" I blinked. She was watching me steadily, and I realized she had understood the situation considerably faster than I had given her credit for, which was itself a lesson I ought to have anticipated. "He may," I said honestly. She looked at the book. Then she closed it carefully, with one finger marking her place. "Your grandmother did say there would be no eligible men." "Yes," I said, "she did." A silence, Is your brother aware of that characterization? He is not. She considered this. The rain tapped against the window behind her. Mr. Ravel, she said at last, I have spent 3 very pleasant years since my grandmother died being exactly as unimportant as I wish to be. I have my house. I have my books. I have a garden that is developing nicely and a woman in the village who makes excellent ginger biscuits, and I want to be very clear about this, I am not in need of rescuing. I understand, I said. Do you? Yes, I said. And I think, if you told my brother the same thing, he would find it the most refreshing sentence he has heard in 3 years. She looked at me for a long time. Then she uncurled from the window seat and stood, the book tucked under her arm. Show me the estate library, she said. Not because I am interested in your brother, because your grandmother told me you have a first edition of Hakluyt's Voyages that belonged to your great-great-grandfather, and I would like to see if it is true. It was true. My great-great-grandfather had purchased it in 1742, and it sat on the second shelf from the top in the north alcove, in a green leather binding that had gone soft with age. Miss Doyle stood in front of it for a full 2 minutes before she touched it, and when she did, she handled it the way my grandmother handled the good china, with a reverence that came from knowing exactly what it was. May I? She said, and it took me a moment to realize she was asking me, not because I had any authority over it, but because she was the kind of woman who asked before she touched what was not hers. Of course, I said. She lifted it out of its place with both hands, carried it to the reading stand, and opened it. I watched her face as she turned the first pages, the careful absorption, the small, unconscious still of her breath. She had the quality, rare in my experience, of being genuinely, entirely present to the thing in front of her. No corner of her was composing what she would say about it later, or considering how it reflected on her, or wondering what anyone watching would think. She was simply reading. The annotations in the margins, she said after a moment. Did your great-great-grandfather add those? I looked. Small, precise script, brown with age, ran along the edges of several pages. I believe so. I confess I have never examined it closely. She looked up at me briefly, not with judgment, just with the mild surprise of someone who finds a thing she expected to be guarded is not. There are at least 3 different hands, she said. It has been read by several generations. We are not an unread family, I said, only an unsystematic one. The corner of her mouth moved. I noticed. Cashin found us there 20 minutes later. He had, I think, been composing reasons to enter the library, and when he opened the door and found his brother and a guest standing together in the north alcove with the Hakluyt open between them, he stopped. The binding, said Miss Doyle without looking up, is original. The end papers have been reinforced, probably early in the last century. You can see the difference in the paper weight, but the text block is intact. Do you know if it was rebound at any point? Cashin came forward, drawn and despite himself. My grandmother would know, he said. I'll ask her. She turned a page gently. It is in extraordinary condition. We do not use this room enough, he said. It came out differently than it was meant to, less complaint, more confession. She looked up at him then, and for a moment I saw the same thing my grandmother must have seen, the thing that had made her hide this young woman behind 17 other invitations and keep her in reserve. Miss Doyle looked at my brother the same way she looked at the Hakluyt, not with the awe that most people brought to the Duke of Varnicliffe, and not with the careful performance of disinterest that some of them affected. She looked at him with her particular clear, assessing attention. She looked at him as a person of some interest, whose value she had not yet determined but was willing to examine. He had not been looked at that way before. I could see that it unsettled him. I could see just as clearly that he did not want her to stop. I excused myself shortly after. I had several letters to write, none of which were urgent, but which served as a sufficient reason to leave the room. As I pulled the library door closed behind me, I heard him say, The collection in the east alcove is older. There are some maps from the 16th century that I have never known what to do with. And her answer, Show me. My grandmother was in the morning room, drinking tea with a contentment she was making very little effort to disguise. You planned this, I said. I have planned everything, she said serenely, since 1784, more or less. She knows. Of course she knows. She is not a fool. My grandmother set down her cup. She will not make it easy for him, Edmund. That is rather the point. He has had 17 young women who made it perfectly, entirely too easy. They wanted Varnicliffe. They wanted the title. They wanted a duke, and they made no particular effort to disguise it. Your brother is a proud man and a private one, and he has spent 3 years having the most important thing about him, not the title, not the house, but himself, looked directly past. She will not look past it. She may not want him at all, I said. No, said my grandmother. She may not. That is also rather the point. She picked up her tea again. You cannot want something that is already in your hands. Cashin needs to want something he cannot simply claim. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly. The rain continued. The other guests played cards and talked, and did the ordinary things guests do when they cannot go out of doors. I happened to pass the library door twice, and both times I heard voices inside. Not the careful, managed exchange of people on their best behavior, but the quick, overlapping rhythm of argument. Not quarrel, something better. Two people who disagreed about something and were both too interested in the disagreement to pretend otherwise. The second time I paused long enough to catch a fragment. His voice, the catalogue in the West Tower, is entirely wrong. Whoever organized it in my grandfather's time had no system. Her voice, he had a system, it is just not yours. A pause. It is a chaos. It is organized by the date of acquisition, which is an entirely coherent system if you know what you are looking for. Another pause and then quieter. You worked that out from looking at it for 20 minutes. 15, she said. Would you like me to explain it? Silence, and then, with something in it I had not heard in my brother's voice in a very long time. Yes. He was different at dinner that evening. He was not precisely cheerful. Cashin was not a man who did cheerful, but there was something present in him that had not been there before, a particular quality of alertness, as though the room was more interesting to him than it had been in the morning. He listened more than he spoke, which was always a sign that he was genuinely engaged. He watched Miss Doyle talk with the other guests. She was not loud, not performing, but people tended to orient towards her, I noticed, without quite knowing why, with an expression I can only describe as careful, as though he was trying to memorize something he was not yet sure he was allowed to keep. She caught him looking once. She did not look away. She held his gaze for a moment, steady, unsurprised, neither encouraging nor discouraging, and then she turned back to her conversation. But I saw the faintest color rise at her cheek, and I thought, my grandmother is very clever. The third day brought clear weather and an expedition to the Folly at the far end of the park, which my grandmother organized with the casual authority of a general directing a campaign. She placed herself, with some assistance from her gout, in the slower-moving group, and she placed my brother, through a series of arrangements so natural they could not have been planned, except that they very obviously were, at the front of the walking party, where Miss Doyle also happened to be. I walked with the middle group and watched. They did not walk together, precisely, for the first part of the trail. They walked parallel to each other, talking to different people, until the path narrowed at the old stone bridge and everyone rearranged, and they ended up side by side without either of them having particularly chosen it. I saw him offer his hand on a rough patch of ground. I saw her consider it, not the coy hesitation of a woman performing reluctance, but the genuine pause of a woman deciding whether to accept help from someone whose opinion of her was still undetermined. She took it. He did not let go when the path smoothed again. She noticed this. She did not remove her hand. They walked the rest of the way to the Folly like that without discussing it, and when they sat on the Folly steps in the autumn sunshine and talked, I could not hear the words at that distance, only the rhythm. It had the easy quality of people who have known each other longer than they have, who have found, to their own mild surprise, that the other person makes conversation feel less effortful than it usually does. On the last evening of the party, I found my grandmother before dinner in the garden, wrapped in her heavy wool shawl against the cold, looking at the bare rose beds with satisfaction. "Has he spoken to her?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "He will." "And if she refuses him?" My grandmother was quiet for a moment. A blackbird crossed the darkening sky above the yew hedge, heading for the wood. "Then he will have learned something he needed to know, that there are women who look at him and see a man, not a title, and he will know that it is possible to feel that even once, and that what he has been settling for before was nothing like it." "That seems a hard lesson." "All useful lessons are hard." She turned back toward the house. "Come inside, Edmund. You will catch a chill, and I will not have two of you sulking." He spoke to her after dinner. I did not witness it directly. I had more sense than to hover. But I happened to be in the corridor when they came out of the small study off the main hall, and I could see from his face, and from the way she walked, quiet and straight and not at all distressed, that whatever had passed between them had not ended badly. She came to stand beside me at the hall window, where I was examining a small watercolor of Varnicliffe as it had looked 60 years ago. "He asked permission to write to me," she said. And I told him he might, but that I made no promises about what the letters would lead to, and that if his letters were formal and titled and full of ducal consequence, I should write back informing him that 3,000 books were better company. She looked at the watercolor. He said he would take the risk. I looked at her profile, the direct, unguarded expression, the slight lift of something that was not quite amusement but was close to it. "Miss Doyle," I said, "for what it is worth, I think my grandmother has been extraordinarily selective with her scheming." She glanced at me. "She is a formidable woman. She is the most formidable woman I have ever known." "Good taste runs in the family, then," she said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it, and then she went to say her good nights. The letters began 3 days after the party ended. I know this because Cashin told me, with a self-consciousness that was entirely unlike him, that he had written one and was not sure it was adequate. I asked what he had written about. He said he had written about the West Tower catalogue and the question of whether acquisition order was ever preferable to subject order, and that she had written back arguing, with a good deal of wit and 3 counterexamples, that it depended entirely on what one expected a library to do. He had, he said, never before received a letter that he wanted to read twice. Over the following weeks the letters became more frequent, and the subjects broadened: the condition of the tenant cottages on the Varnicliffe eastern border, which she had some practical opinions about, having managed her grandmother's smaller estate; the question of what to do with the estate accounts, which had not been properly reorganized since the late Duke's time; the first edition Hacklight, about which she had done further research and had several findings to share; and then, more slowly, other things. The garden at her house, the ginger biscuits from the village, which she had at last obtained the recipe for and had sent him 3 in a small wrapped parcel, her grandmother, whom she had loved very much. The particular loneliness of being the only sensible person in a room, which he had apparently spent a great deal of his life experiencing, and which she understood with such precision that he had, according to him, had to put the letter down and go stand by the window for several minutes before he could continue reading. He went to call on her in December without my grandmother's engineering, entirely on his own. He told me this the evening before he went, not quite asking my opinion, but in the way of a man who has made up his mind and is testing the weight of it against someone else's company. I said only that Thorndon was 4 hours by road, and he should not arrive after dark. He gave me the look this deserved, and said he was aware of how roads worked. He told me about it afterward. He had arrived at her house, modest, well-kept, with climbing roses cut back for winter against the front wall, and she had opened the door herself because her housekeeper was out and had said, without any particular ceremony, "You should have written first. I would have made certain there was cake." "I didn't want cake," he said. "I wanted to see if it was real." If what was real? He had apparently struggled to explain this, and she had waited with her customary patience until he managed it. What he said, in the end, was that he had spent a considerable time believing that a conversation that meant something to him must mean less to the other person, because it always had before, and he had wanted to see, not the letters, not the careful, composed best of himself that a letter permitted, but the actual reality of her in the actual reality of a room, to see if the thing that the letters felt like was still true when there was no ink and paper between them. She had let him in. She had made him tea and produced from somewhere a plate of ginger biscuits, her own batch this time, she said, made from the village woman's recipe, and not quite as good yet but improving. And he had eaten 3 of them, which she apparently noted, and which, he told me, gave him the obscure sense of having passed some kind of examination without knowing the subject matter in advance. They had sat in her small drawing room, not grand. She had made no particular effort to impose grandeur on it, and he had met her cat, a large and opinionated tabby who spent the first 20 minutes on his lap and the next 20 attempting to remove his cravat, and she had talked and he had talked. And after an hour he had looked at the light and realized with some shock that the afternoon had passed entirely, and he had not once consulted his watch or thought about anything that needed doing. "What did you say," I asked, "when you left?" "I asked if I might come again." And she said. He was quiet for a moment, and there was something in his face that I had not seen in 3 years, something clear and young, almost, under the gravity he usually wore. She said yes. He came again in January, and in February. By March he was writing 3 times a week and calling at Thorndon, her house, at least once a fortnight, and my grandmother, when I reported this to her, simply poured herself more tea. He proposed in April, among the early roses, because she had shown him the climbing roses coming back into bud and explained each variety to him, and he had listened to all of it and then said, very simply, that he did not wish to spend another rose season without her. She told me she had asked him, before she answered, to tell her what exactly he thought she was bringing to this. He had said, "Yourself," which is more than I expected and exactly what I required. She told him yes. I was present at the wedding in June, at a small country church with a congregation that was half the county and half a guest list our grandmother had quietly and precisely assembled. My grandmother sat in the front pew and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who has watched a plan come to its conclusion and is quietly, entirely satisfied. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. Cashin, at the altar, had none of the stiffness I had watched him carry through 17 polite mornings and 17 careful lunches and 17 perfectly courteous farewells. He stood there in the early summer light, in the church his family had filled for generations, and when the doors opened and she came through them, quiet, unadorned, wearing white with the same practical ease with which she wore everything, I watched the last of his guardedness leave his face. He was simply wholly glad. After the wedding breakfast, when the guests had begun to circulate and the tables were being cleared and the afternoon light came slanted and golden through the windows, I found my grandmother in the garden with her wine, watching the roses. "You hid her behind 17 women," I said. "I introduced 17 women," she said. "They were all perfectly adequate. It was not their fault that your brother is excessively particular." She sipped her wine. "I needed him to know what he was looking for before I gave it to him. A man who does not know what he wants cannot recognize it when it arrives. And now he does. And now he has it." She looked at the roses. "She will be good for him, Edmund, not because she is biddable, she is not biddable in the least, but because she is real. He has never before had anyone in his life who treated him as entirely real." I thought about that for a moment. That is a great deal to give someone. "Yes," said my grandmother, "it is, which is why it matters that he is in no danger of taking it for granted." She was right about that, too. She was, as I have said, generally right. I left them in the garden as the shadows lengthened, my brother and his new wife, standing together in the long evening light, not speaking, just looking at the house. And I saw her look at it, the way she had looked at it on the first afternoon, not with awe, not with calculation, but with that clear, steady gaze. Only this time, after a moment, she turned from the house and looked at him, and what was on her face then was something quite different. It was the way she had looked at the hacklight, at the thing of value, the thing that was worth something, the thing you did not handle carelessly because it could not be replaced. My brother, who had spent 3 years believing himself visible to everyone and truly known to no one, looked back at her. And I saw in his face, for the first time in as long as I could remember, a man who felt completely and without reservation that he had been found. I walked back to the house alone. Behind me, through the long June evening, I heard her laugh, not performed, not careful, just itself, and I heard him say something I could not make out, and then the sound of 2 people who had made up their minds about each other and intended to stay that way. My grandmother had been right. She always was.